I'm just going to really talk about kind of what our process has been in Colorado, what's in our drought plan, and then how we use it. We are in the process of updating a drought plan right now. We update it every 5 years per FEMA requirements, and I'll give you a little teaser of kind of what's going to be in that. But this is really kind of focusing on our existing plan, not the one that hasn't yet been approved. Quick overview of Colorado. Most of you guys know where we're located. Hopefully you know where we're located. We share a border with y'all. We're neighbors. We can wave to each other. But we are a water exporting state. We are one of only 2 water exporting states in the U.S. Anyone know the other one? It's my favorite trivia question. No one gets it right. Hawaii. So we are one of only 2 water exporting states in the U.S., Hawaii being the other one. They export it to the ocean. We export it to you all. So managing our water resources is really important because all the water flows out of our states. We do not have any major river systems that flow into our state. So drought is also a really common occurrence in Colorado. Much like you all, we have a semi-arid environment. On average, we get about 14 inches of precipitation a year, but because we're very topographically diverse, some of that falls in the mountains. We get a lot up there, a lot less down in the valleys and on the eastern plains. But about once every 9 out of every 10 years, some level of drought impacts some portion of the state of Colorado. So we're used to dealing with drought, and we recognize that it has great impacts on our economy and our quality of life. We also know that we have seen 2.5 degrees of warming in the last 30 years, or in the last 50 years, 2 degrees in the last 30 years, and we project that we're going to see an additional 2 to 6 degrees of Fahrenheit by mid-century, and that impacts our water resources. We already have seen a trend in increasing drought frequency of occurrence. I woke up at 3:15 this morning to catch my flight, and I don't normally drink coffee, and I've had 3 cups of coffee, so I'm a flamboyant speaker to begin with. You guys, this is going to be, I'm glad this is getting captured on YouTube. So we expect to warm an additional 2 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century. That's going to impact our water resources, much of which is surface water. We're also growing rapidly, and so demand is a big issue. So balancing all of those issues is what kind of led to Colorado developing our first drought plan. I think Cody's presentation earlier said that, we were one of those first 3 in the 80s. I think we were actually the first state to have a drought plan. It arose as a result of the drought in the late 70s. We did a really great job creating a model of how you should do drought planning. We then proceeded to let it sit on a shelf and collect dust for 20 years. Everyone else did better than us, and the early 2000 drought hit, and we realized that we were woefully unprepared for drought. So I came on in 2007-ish with the charge of revamping the state drought plan and really looking at how can we make this a plan that not only is not outdated, but actually works for us and is a living document that we can use as kind of a 101 guide to drought response and mitigation. And so I'm going to walk you through kind of what we did with that. We've already talked about the purpose of drought planning. It's all kind of the same. You want to coordinate with other planning efforts. You want to make sure you're in line with emergency operations and FEMA requirements and all of that. But at the same time, really what you want to do is make it hurt less when you're in the midst of a drought, right? That's what it's all about, is you want your response to be timely, you want your mitigation to be effective. So that's all of that stuff. We've already talked about that this morning. You guys know that. I'll move right through it. Plans. We all do plans. They frequently sit on shelves. We are trying really hard to move away from that in Colorado and to have our plans be kind of road maps and frameworks as to how we should be moving collectively together to achieve a goal. We like to have measurable objectives in our plans. We like to come back and report out on what's going on. And we like to have a lot of a lot of overlap between plans. So instead of being, you know, a checkerboard, it's like Madras. It's like the Madras plaid where it's all intertwined together. And we're reinforcing one another with our planning processes. This can get really confusing because oftentimes there's like multiple people working on multiple plans all at the same time, which is really great for making your hair turn gray. But it can also be really effective in making sure that you have the connections across agencies and stakeholder groups to ensure that you're all moving towards the same objective. So this is actually from the Director of Western Water Assessment. And the importance of actionable science, it's just kind of answering that so what question. This is super important to Colorado because we kind of feel like there's a fundamental disconnect between the research community and the policymakers. The research community is constantly looking for the next question. It's how they get funding. No shame in that. But decision makers are looking to use the science that we have today to not to understand the uncertainties about it so much, but to understand how it's reliable enough that they can make better informed decisions. And so if you're constantly looking for the next question and pointing out the uncertainties or the drawbacks or limitations, then you can't really communicate how that information can be used for to inform better decisions today. And so we have to work together to create usable science so that those two things can come together. And this has kind of been the foundation of what we've been doing, not only with drought, but also with climate and water resource planning over the last 10 years. Okay, so what's in our plan? The Colorado Drought Plan is a drought mitigation and response plan. So we were one of those 13 states that Cody mentioned that do both drought mitigation and response. This is kind of what it is. It's a really thick document. There's a whole lot of stuff inside of it. If you have insomnia issues, I'm happy to get you the links to this. You can read it. No, it's actually fascinating. But we do break it out so that people can pull out the pieces that they need. And that's by design. We don't want people to feel overwhelmed by how big the drought plan is. We want people to be able to pull out the pieces that they want. So if they just want to know about monitoring, they can pull out that annex. If they just want to know the response plan, like what happens when we hit these certain thresholds, they can pull that out. If they want the kind of core document that has a whole historical look at drought in Colorado and what we've done then they can pull that piece out. And so that was actually by design that we broke this up into so many different sections. So this is just kind of outlining those sections a little bit more. But one of the key pieces that I want to talk about that I think really sets Colorado apart is our vulnerability assessment. So we decided when we were doing a vulnerability assessment, we wanted to not just do a qualitative vulnerability assessment, which is what many people do. We wanted to do a quantitative vulnerability assessment. So our vulnerability assessment is quantitative and qualitative. We actually go through and score by county. I'll show you what that looks like. And we break it down by sector. So looking at everything from state assets, which is kind of this weird catch-all that FEMA requires, to socioeconomic, to some of our main economic drivers like agriculture and environment, recreation, and tourism. Did that advance? Oh, it did, yeah. We also decided that because warming is such a big driver in the state of Colorado and it impacts our snowpack so heavily, we needed to look at climate change implications on our water resources when talking about drought. It also impacts our crop irrigation requirements. We're an agricultural state, and so that really drives up demand. We felt we needed to include that in there. So we've done a lot of analysis on that. We also have gone back multiple times, each time we update this drought plan, and looked at our indices. And so what do we use to inform our decision making? And I'll walk you through some of that. And then we have some of the appendices that are really good for maybe you guys that are putting together drought plans and want to know how we define things or what our acronyms are, or where we got this information, but probably are some of the lesser looked at pieces of our plan. These are some of our goals. Again, we revise this every time we go through. They haven't changed that much this time, but we really want to make sure that each time we're looking at this plan, our goals are evolving with us, right? Because goals shift, goals change. As you achieve one thing, you might be striving for another, and so we want to capture that with our drought plan. And then the other piece that I'll say is that it is all about collaboration. So we actually have a drought planning committee that helps do the actual plan, and then we have all the other components for the response and mitigation piece, which I'll go into later. But these are just folks that sit on our drought planning committee. You can see some of these folks are in the room here today, but not just governmental agencies, but private sector as well, right? So tourism and rec, really big in Colorado, really big in Utah. We want to get those river rafters. We want to get those ski resorts there because those are some of our partners that will be impacted during an actual drought. So this is our plan implementation cycle. Normal conditions, we're in monitoring. Like Utah, we have a task force that is always active just for monitoring, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Then we go into phase 1. That's kind of when you're like, good, it's getting dry, I'm really uncomfortable. That's about where I was from November to January, February of this year, where you're just kind of crossing your fingers, waiting and seeing. Phase 2 is kind of activation. We are activated via a gubernatorial memo sent out to all the cabinet members. And that activates our task forces that I'll go into. And then we have phase 3, which is full activation of the plan across all sectors. In my time, we've actually never hit phase 3 because the way that we have designed our plan is that we can activate it for certain areas of the state for certain sectors. And so, for instance, this year, we are only currently activated for the agricultural sector because we had really strong reservoir storage, and so we haven't seen huge municipal impacts. And this northeast corner of our state, where a large portion of our population lives, is actually not experiencing drought conditions. And so one of the things that Seth talked about is that messaging piece. For a rec and tourism state, you don't want to be sending the message, hey, the whole state's activated for drought the last week of March when you're in your ski season. And because we live on this instantaneous information Twittersphere, that actually impacts tourism. And so we want to be cognizant of how those pieces move together. All right, so indices. Really quickly, we have the SWASI, the Surface Water Supply Index, as well as Palmer. When we first did this drought plan update, we thought for sure we were going to get rid of Palmer. We felt like it was outdated. It only resonated with agriculture. We actually did an analysis to see what kind of value it provides and how that information can be utilized, and decided it for certain, depending on what you're looking at, the Palmer was actually really helpful. So in deciding what indices you use for decision making, you have to ask what kind of information do you want, right? There is no catch-all, end-all, be-all index that's going to give you all the information. You're going to want to look at a whole host of different things. And when you're trying to predict winter wheat yield, Palmer is actually really beneficial. And so we decided to keep it in. SPI, predominantly 6-month, although you can use it on different time scales because, again, as Seth talked about, the rise of or acknowledgement of these flash droughts is really important. We did add the Drought Monitor into the plan in 2013, and I have it out there kind of to the side. And this was talked about the evolution of the Drought Monitor. In 2002, people felt that the drought, and even in 2007-8, people felt like the Drought Monitor, while it had really good depiction of kind of what conditions were, they felt like it had like a 2 to 4 week lag in actually reflecting the conditions on the ground. And one of the things that we did when we updated our plan in 2008 was worked really, really closely with our state climatologist office, with NIDIS, with the Drought Monitor to kind of get that feedback. And around that same time was when they were working with the federal government and their federal partners with FSA to streamline that whole drought declaration process, which used to take weeks. It used to have to be a county recommendation that goes to the governor, that then goes back to the county, that then goes to FSA. And it would take weeks and weeks and weeks for those FSA secretarial designations to go through. Now it happens automatically thanks to more confidence in the U.S. Drought Monitor. And so we are really proud of that partnership and really proud of that feedback, even though it clogs up inboxes with hundreds of emails a day. Thankfully, I've never subscribed to that. But it's a really important tool for us because we feel like it now actually does reflect conditions on the ground. And if there are areas where we feel like it's not reflecting conditions on the ground, we actually are informed enough to know why, and have those discussions. So now I'm going to go through what our response piece is. So I think Cody gave a glimpse of it. Cody was smart. He gave like the good conditions summary. I'm giving you the what we're doing now. So I want to say that with this, these are guidelines. They are not hard and fast rules as to where we should be and what we should be doing. We do have thresholds for each of our indices that we use. They are numeric, but there are often times that we hit one threshold here, another threshold there, or we hit, we're in D4, but the 6-month SPI is different than the 12-month SPI. And so we take actions that we feel are appropriate given the conditions and also given the impacts. Thank you. So by the physical indicators, we could be in phase 3 for many aspects of our current conditions. But because it is not statewide, because it is not economy-wide that we're seeing some of these impacts, we haven't yet taken that step. We really like that flexibility because we feel like we can respond and react in real time. We also, when we updated our drought plan, revised our response framework because this was what I came into and I had no clue what it meant. Still, to this day, I've looked at this so many times. No one knew who was doing what or who they were supposed to be talking to or when, so nobody talked to anyone about anything and nothing got accomplished, which is a super effective way to govern. And so we decided that we should streamline the response framework, and this is our current response framework. So you can see that our WATF, which is our Water Availability Task Force, that is our monitoring arm. It is always operating. We meet almost monthly, not quite, but almost monthly to talk about conditions. We engage with our federal partners on this. NRCS presents, our Climate Center presents. So that is always going. That's where we're monitoring conditions, both during drought and during good times. And then we have our Agricultural Impact Task Force currently that is activated. Their main job is to collect information about impacts and what's happening on the ground. We also have energy, municipal, and wildlife. You'll see that we do not have tourism and recreation, and we do not have wildfire. We used to. We ixnayed both of those, one, because wildfire has a super streamlined process for response. When a fire hits, they know what to do, they know where to go, who to talk to, and how to respond. There was no point in us recreating that. We were just going to add another layer of bureaucracy to folks that were already doing a really awesome job responding, and we did not want to get in the mix of that. Instead, we inserted ourselves into their process. So I have a direct line to folks who are on the ground. I can get that information. I sit on some of the task forces for them for recovery, both short-term and long-term. And so we're not recreating the wheel here. They also sit on my drought task force, which I'll get to in a second. And so they can do that report out, but we're not getting in their way. We also, from a political standpoint, it sends a really big message to activate a wildfire task force. We learned in 2002, our governor at the time made the mistake of on a newscast saying all of Colorado is on fire. Turns out that really impacts tourism and recreation. People don't really want to go to a place that's on fire. And so now our messaging is more like, hey, we've currently got 250,000 acres on fire, but that's okay because we have 66 million acres in the state of Colorado. And so we just never activated it because we didn't want that messaging component. The same is true with tourism and recreation. If you activate Tourism and Recreation Task Force in the middle of the ski season or in the middle of the rafting and fishing season, you're sending a message to potential visitors that could really impact the economy of these communities that are really reliant upon that. So again, we just insert ourselves into their already streamlined process. They sit on our drought task force. We didn't feel like we lost anything, but we didn't have to deal with some of the complicated messaging components. So our drought task force is a cabinet level group of folks. It's led by the directors of our ag department, our local affairs department, natural resources, and emergency management. And so we meet every 3 weeks and talk about what's going on. The Ag Impact Task Forces report up to them. They then act as a conduit to the governor. And we have a pretty streamlined decision-making process. We also have this drought response page. I think someone had mentioned earlier the confusion that exists when you have local control states and one water provider has restrictions and another water provider doesn't, and then they have different messaging ways. One uses circle dot or circle square triangle, one uses odd even. No one knows what they're supposed to do. So in 2012, when we were dealing with drought, we actually came up with this drought meter, which can be replicated on individual water providers' pages, but also a searchable database by zip code, so folks can look up what their restrictions are. We also hold drought tours as part of our response. We're actually doing this next week. And this really brings high-level decision makers to drought-affected areas. Most of these folks have no idea what exceptional or extreme drought looks like. They have no idea what it means on the ground. They have no idea how it's really impacting everyone's day-to-day life on the ground. So we get them out into the fields. They actually get dirt on their boots, and they look at what this means. They talk to people. It's also an opportunity. We don't have a ton of resources at the state of Colorado to respond to drought. We sure as heck can't make it rain. And so in times of drought, this is their opportunity to dialogue directly with high-level decision makers to say, hey, this is what's going on. This is what I need from you. If you guys could enact something that did X, Y, and Z, this would make it hurt a whole lot less. So next week's drought tour in southwestern Colorado, I think I have 6 cabinet members, the lieutenant governor. We have our whole federal delegation represented. So we end up bringing about 50 or 60 people together to talk about this. We've done this twice before. It's been really, really successful. All right, I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to go really fast through mitigation. Some of our mitigation action strategies really all focused on making it hurt less. How do we improve this system so things hurt less? That may be improving our early warning system. In 2011, the drought hit on the Eastern Plains. We realized that we didn't have very good monitoring infrastructure on the Eastern Plains. Our weather stations were about 100 miles apart, made it really difficult to know what the conditions are on the ground, especially when you're talking about monsoon season and convection-based precipitation that is spotty, right? Like it can happen 5 miles away from each other. There can be a really stark difference between how much precipitation we're getting. We needed to know that information. So some of it's monitoring, some of it's funding, some of it's coordination and integration, and so that's all really important. Cody already talked about this, so I'm just going to go through it. I just made it animated. I want to talk a little bit about our methodology for our vulnerability assessment and what we do. I mentioned that it was quantitative and qualitative, but one of the cool things about this is that then we take that score. So we actually come up with a score for the quantitative and qualitative piece, and then we cross-check it with the experts on the ground, and we adjust based on that adaptive capacity. So one thing that came up in doing this was, hey, you would think that fisheries are pretty susceptible to drought impacts during a drought. Well, yes, they are, except for the fact that our wildlife managers are super keyed in on this, and they're able to actually move and relocate fish, and they're really on the kind of front end of monitoring this, and so they actually are able to avoid a lot of the wildlife impacts at some of the fisheries as a result of this. And so, so we can adjust that vulnerability score based on that. We also have a number of things that go into it, so it's not just one sector. We actually create subsectors. So if you have tourism and recreation, we can do summer tourism and winter tourism. If you have agriculture, we can do crops and livestock. We also adjust based on kind of the weight that plays in, or role that plays. So all the scores are weighted. I know I'm going really, really fast, and I was already amped up to begin with, so now you guys like get me on hyperdrive. So here's some of one example of what this looks like. This is agriculture, so we look at crops, we look at livestock, we also look at the green industry in urban environments. That's a really big economic driver. Turns out there's not a whole lot of data and information on it, but what we do know is that when the agricultural sector is impacted, there's huge economic losses. In 2012, in Colorado alone, we had $409 million of direct loss, but when you add the secondary and tertiary impacts to communities, that drives up to about $630 million of impact. And so we really want to know where our most vulnerable communities are so we can target our resources in the mitigation process beforehand. After that, we come up with a whole bunch of recommendations on what we can do better. This is, we partnered with some folks at NASA to look at total net changes in biomass using some satellite information during the 2012 drought, so we could actually see what was happening. You can tell that that drought was impacting predominantly the Eastern Plains. Got it, thanks. And we come up with overall vulnerability scores. So this is our overall vulnerability score for the state of Colorado. It's 1 to 4. This I'm going to go through really, really quickly, is just tourism and rec. We've done a number of studies on kind of how drought impacts tourism and recreation and how we can improve that process to make sure that there's diversification, that communities are working together, that there is that the economic folks are actually talking to the planning folks and vice versa, so that we can streamline and create a system for community vitality. So we've worked on that. We've also looked at climate change and not just the projections and the models, which can be tricky and contentious, but we've also looked at the paleo record. The reason we looked at the paleo record is we wanted to know what had happened in the past and whether or not the past was a good predictor of what we might see in the future. So what you're looking at here is both the projections for the future, but also looking at a paleo record. The paleo record is the zigzag. The projections are the dotted lines. And what you can see is that in some river basins, like this one, the paleo record actually does a pretty good job capturing the range of variability that the models show that we might be able to see, that are feasible to see in the future or plausible. But in other river basins, the paleo record doesn't do a very good job capturing that range of variability, and so that's probably not something you want to rely on for your decision-making purposes. And then I talked about all of those different planning resources and things that we do and how we integrate it together. This is from our Colorado Water Plan, which is kind of our big visioning roadmap document for water resources in Colorado in general. And we actually factored in climate change into this as one of the drivers. There's about 15 drivers, things like economic growth, regulation, population growth, all the things that you think about when you're doing planning processes. And we have 5 different scenarios. We do scenario-based planning in Colorado. 3 of those scenarios rely on a perturbed climate. And so those are defined in different ways. You can look it up on the web or talk to me later, and I can tell you about it. But we do expect to continue seeing more prolonged, severe, and intense droughts in Colorado, and we feel like that needs to be part of our planning process. I think I only went over by like 2 minutes. And I think we're holding questions until the panel later.